Hello students, this is Jonathan Lipson with The Real Deal on Contracts. Today we'll talk about the statute of frauds. If you are in my class, this corresponds to Unit 15. We'll talk about two things. Number one, what the statute of frauds is, and number two, how it relates to what we've talked about previously on the formation of contracts and consideration. The statute of frauds is really an answer to a basic question, which is, what contracts have to be written to be enforceable? The answer is really just a list or set of lists that various states and courts have developed over the years of those contracts that they say must be written in order to be enforceable. Not all contracts have to be written, right? Many oral promises can be enforceable contracts. But the statute of frauds is the list or a list of contracts that must be written in order for a court to conclude that they are enforceable. In addition to, looking to things like offer and acceptance and consideration. I'm not a big fan of mnemonic devices, but if you are, I have one for you that can, I think, capture common types of contracts on the list. This list, it is MOLES $500. MOLES $500. Let me just whiffle through them. Number one, M, a contract made upon consideration of marriage. If I agree to marry you in exchange for your house or your Porsche or whatever, then that would have to be written down. Number two, O, a contract that cannot be performed within 1 year from its making. Number three, L, a contract for the sale of an interest in land. L. There's an important exception here known as the part performance doctrine, which says that if an oral promise has been made to transfer land in exchange for services that have almost entirely been performed on the part of the recipient or putative recipient of the land, the promise to transfer the land will be enforceable, at least under some conditions. Powell's an example of a case where the promise was enforceable. Rodman, by contrast, is an example of a case where it wasn't. Those are in the notes. We'll discuss those. That's M, that's O, that's L. E, the contract of an executor to answer for the duties or obligations of a decedent. Number five, S, a contract to answer for the monetary obligation of another, often known as a suretyship. S, suretyship, or guarantee contract. There's an exception here too, known as the main purpose doctrine, which essentially says that if a guarantor's or surety's main purpose was its own financial interest or benefit, then that will be outside of the statute of frauds, meaning that it can be oral and still be enforceable. And finally, number six, $500. A contract for the sale of goods under the UCC, where the price is more than $500, must be written to be enforceable under UCC 2201. Note, however, that 2201 has some exceptions that you want to pay attention to. That's MOLES $500. There's a general exception, I think, for all of these kinds of statute of frauds contracts, which is a version of promissory estoppel that appears in Restatement Section 139. I won't read it to you here, but basically, like Section 90 of the Restatement, which also is a kind of promissory estoppel, it's simply saying that if there's been detrimental reliance on an oral promise, and justice requires that we enforce the promise, then notwithstanding the fact that there was supposed to be a writing but wasn't, a court may enforce the promise. Number two, how do the statute of frauds, consideration, and formation relate to one another? Which really requires us to talk about their similarities and their differences. So similarities. Well, first of all three of these things, formation, consideration, statute of frauds, they're all prerequisites to the legal recognition of a contract, right? If you're missing any of those three things, a court is likely to say that the contract does not exist, is not enforceable. Number two, all are examples of contract formalities, all of which involve communication about the substance of the contract. offer and acceptance, communication about willingness to do a deal, consideration, right, the inducement of promises and performance one for the other, and statute frauds, right, communication, has to take a certain form for certain types of contracts, i.e. it has to be written. Formalism is this idea that we will apply rules sometimes without regard to context, right? So Kirksey, right? The court says, well, there's no consideration. That's just the law. We don't care if it's unfair or if it feels biased or what have you. It's a kind of formalist approach. Contrasts with the idea of what's sometimes known as legal realism, which is that actually we do sometimes care about varying the rules depending on the context. Why? Well, because sometimes the rules applied in a formalistic way just produce results that we consider unfair, like somehow unacceptable. We sometimes call that equity. Equitable exceptions are usually exceptions to formal rules of law. And you can see that those are sometimes in tension. Sometimes they're in sync. But the rules under the statute of frauds, like offer and acceptance and consideration, those are all sort of formalistic rules about the recognition of contracts. Third, contract, in the event that you have a problem involving any of these three things, and a court concludes that a contract is not enforceable for one of these defects, the question then becomes, well, is there a remedy for the person who nevertheless might have changed position in reliance on the oral promise or what have you? And the answer is generally not like the conventional remedies that you've seen so far at law, like expectation or reliance. Those aren't available because there's no contract. Instead, we say there might be remedies available off contract, like restitution or other equitable remedies. Finally, let's talk about differences. Each of these are just different grounds for a court to conclude that a contract may not be enforceable. So you just have to know the tests for each of these three types of things. And there are different exceptions for each. Restatement Section 90, I think, is typically viewed as an exception to claim that a contract is unenforceable for a failure of mutual assent or consideration, whereas Restatement Section 139 is an equitable exception to the requirement that a contract be written. That's the real deal on the statute of frauds. I look forward to talking about it more in class.